The best analogy I've ever heard to explain why show notes are vitally important to your podcast is this. Imagine you've just opened a brand new, state-of-the-art cycle studio offering a ton of different classes. It's got the best music, top-notch equipment, and amazing instructors. Now all you need is members to join. The problem, though, is that you got a really good deal on real estate, so the entrance is sort of down an alleyway, away from the main bustling streets. There's just not a ton of street traffic walking by. Not exactly a prime location for attracting clients. So you get smart and decide to put an A-frame sign on the nearby busiest street with a big arrow pointing toward your hidden gem. The sign is crucial, catching the eye of potential customers and guiding them right to your studio. And your podcast, you guessed it, is just like your cycle studio. It's packed with valuable content and episodes, but it might not be the first thing listeners stumble upon. It's taking up a little corner of the podcast listening apps, available to any listener, but not necessarily front and center next to Huberman Lab or Tim Ferriss quite yet. So what you need is an A-frame sign, aka your podcast description and episode show notes, to point potential listeners in your direction. All of the words you include in your podcast work to encourage potential listeners to turn down that darkened street corner and hurry directly to your podcast to strap in and start listening. That's how good these show notes will be when we're done with this episode. We'll talk about how you can take advantage of SEO, how to make your episode titles pop, what information you should include in your show notes, and so much more. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Jamie Kennedy, executive podcast producer at Brave Moon Podcasts. We've produced podcasts for Virgin Active Health Clubs, Functional Training Institute, well-being coaches and speakers, and many more. I'm including all of the insider secrets I've learned along the way being a podcast producer for some of the top health and fitness brands on the charts today. So whether you're a small business owner, health and fitness professional, or a wellness enthusiast looking to boost your brand through podcasting, this podcast is for you. For a comprehensive list of the equipment and software my clients use, head to my website and grab my free Start a Podcast guide. I've condensed months of research into this guide, offering you the industry's best choices. Download it today. The link is in the show notes. In episode 14 of this podcast, I talked about attracting your ideal target audience by taking advantage of SEO specifically. Just a refresher, SEO is search engine optimization. If you haven't already taken a listen to that episode and you're curious about what SEO really is, be sure to go have a listen to that episode first. Then jump back here so we can dive deep into what exactly your show notes should contain to grow your listener base. So let's start by defining what I mean when I refer to show notes. Show notes in its most base form is the description attached to each episode of your podcast. They appear slightly different depending on which listening app you're reviewing, but essentially it's the description that people read when they're considering whether to listen to an episode of yours or not. In addition to these show notes, there are 3 other pieces of writing that are super important to helping your podcast get discovered in the listening apps. 1, your podcast name. 2, your main podcast description. And 3, your episode titles. Your podcast name is the main title you've chosen to represent your podcast as a whole. For example, Glennon Doyle's is We Can Do Hard Things. Andrew Huberman's is Huberman Lab. Your main podcast description is the hero description that explains exactly what your podcast is about, who it's for, and why it exists. For each individual episode, you then have an episode title. For example, Huberman did a podcast episode titled Controlling Sugar Cravings and Metabolism with Science-Based Tools. My podcast client, Jen and Mike Whidden, with their podcast Raising You, Raising Them, did a podcast episode titled What is Conscious Parenting? All of these, your podcast name, podcast description, episode title, and show notes are searchable. So if someone gets the urge to search sugar cravings, for example, Huberman's episode will appear in the search results. But also, podcasts related to sugar will appear as well. The point is this: focus and optimize all of these, making sure to add keywords and phrases to each one, and you've got yourself a gorgeously well thought out podcast that is easy to discover. For this episode, and to streamline the discussion, I'm going to refer to all of these under one name, show notes, but know that everything I'm about to share can be applied to each of these pieces of writing individually or cohesively. So I know that we've talked about it in episode 14, but let's talk more about SEO, aka search engine optimization. I'm going to give you an example because I think it's an easier way to understand how it works. Imagine you're searching for a meditation podcast on your phone. You can be searching in your web browser on something like Google, or you can be searching within the podcast listening apps like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Now, ideally, your show notes will be indexed, aka searchable, in both Google and the listening apps. But here's what I love most about the listening apps. Let's say you're typing in meditation podcast into the Google search bar. You're going to get millions of page options to click on, 60.5 million results to be exact, as of 2024. That's because there's literally millions of websites that reference or discuss meditation podcasts. Now, imagine if you instead typed meditation podcast into Spotify. Granted, since I've just done this, I'm seeing there are a few thousand at least, but I'll tell you now, it's nowhere near the 60.5 million results that you're going to get on Google. What this means is that you have a much better chance of having your meditation podcast stand out on the listening apps than you do on Google. And if you add a niche, like I always suggest that you do, you're even more likely to be discovered. So that's why, even though I highly recommend you're creating an online presence outside of the listening apps so that you do get discovered on Google, I would argue that your show notes are your number one offensive lineman, doing everything in your power to ensure your show notes are ready and waiting to get your podcast discovered. So that means your show notes should be doused with relevant searched keywords and phrases. Keywords and phrases that your dream listener is searching for right now. When you add these keywords, you're essentially helping search engines understand what your podcast is about and who it's for. This increases the chance of your podcast appearing in the search results when someone types in keywords related to your topic. Take a look at the podcast Sleep Meditation for Women. They use keywords like sleep meditation, insomnia, and guided meditations throughout their show notes, making them easily discoverable by people searching for these specific terms. They also know exactly who their dream listener is. Not just anyone, but women specifically. This helps set them apart in a big way. Think about it. When you're looking for a meditation podcast, are you just going to click on the very first meditation podcast that you see? Well, maybe, of course. But let's say that right below it, you see that there's a podcast that says Meditation for Women, and you happen to be a woman, so therefore, I would so much rather click on the meditation podcast that relates directly to me as a woman than a more generic meditation podcast. I recommend that between your episode title and show notes that you aim for at least 5 keywords and phrases per episode that your dream listener is searching for. This is a sizable chunk of keywords to ensure the listening apps understand what your episode is about and how they might help putting you in front of the listeners who want to listen to a podcast or episode exactly like yours. In addition to keywords, what else should your show notes include? Number 1 is a clear episode summary. You should briefly describe the key points and topics covered in the episode, giving listeners a quick overview of what to expect from your episode. And links to your resources. If you mention any website, products, or books throughout the episode, providing links directly in your show notes will help your listeners make it easier for them to access them. You should also add links that help your listeners find you online or in the real world. Things like your website and socials should be highlighted, as well as any lead magnets or free resources that you offer. And guest bios. If you have a guest on your show, include a short introduction or bio about them in your show notes. Be sure to add their full name, company, or business because these act as keywords in and of themselves, ready to be searched for in the listening apps. Let's say that you get that high-profile guest onto your podcast. Having their full name in your show notes will actually drive people to find your episode when they search for that high-profile guest in the listening apps. And your episode transcript. Consider providing a full transcript of your episode, especially if your niche is heavily information-based. This makes your content accessible to a wider audience, including people with hearing impairments or those who prefer to read. Because the show notes characters are limited, you'll want to create these on your podcast landing page or blog page and then link to the transcript in your show notes. This is a great way to make your podcast searchable on the search engines as well. Also, it should be noted that certain listening apps like Apple Podcasts already generate transcripts for you. Handy for sure. Now it's time for 5 hacks to make your show notes so effective your listenership will double. Hack number 1. Always start with an intention-grabbing lead. I also call this the curiosity trap. Every episode should be a problem you're solving for your dream listener, right? So what questions would they have surrounding that problem? This could be in the form of a question, surprising fact, or a powerful statement, all with the intention of piquing their curiosity. For this episode, I would use something like, want to double your listeners? Let's improve your show notes. For a podcast about nutrition for IBS, I might say something like, struggling for snack ideas? Let's talk about my top 10 favorite nutritious snacks that help boost digestion and alleviate IBS symptoms. Hack number 2, build your keywords into your summary, but also consider adding additional keywords at the end of your episode show notes. Take a look at my show notes and you'll see that I add a few extra keywords that my dream listener is searching for. This allows me to sneak in a couple more keywords and phrases without having to incorporate them into my actual show notes summary. Hack number 3, always include actionable tips and strategies in your show notes. Don't give everything away from your episode. After all, you want them to actually listen, right? But it's helpful to include, especially if they're takeaways that the listener may want to write down. Make it easy on them and include it in the show notes as well. Hack number 4, choose a format and structure that works for you and stick with it. For example, I have a show notes template that I've created for myself. So every time I go to create a new episode show notes, I just make a copy of that Google Doc and start writing it based on the outline I've already created. This helps keep it consistent for the listener to be able to find what they're looking for, but it also helps you stay organized and remember exactly what to include in each set of show notes that you create. I swear this is a total game-changing time saver as well. Hack number 5, don't forget that the resources you include in the show notes, like books, people, or product recommendations, are also searchable. So if you suggest a book like U-Turn by Ashley Stahl, the listening app may very well rank that episode when someone searches for U-Turn or Ashley Stahl, which, in fact, is the book that changed the entire trajectory of my life. Read it if you dare. Link is in the show notes. Thank you again so much for joining me on your podcasting journey. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review. It helps people like you find this podcast as well. Until the next episode, keep those conversations flowing and keep being the amazing powerhouse that you are. And as always, remember that consistency, authenticity, and promoting your podcast are key to your success. Happy podcasting.